Hey there, APHUG team. This is Sanchez, ready to kick off our political unit with one of our first flip video lectures, which is looking at a discussion of boundaries, which is obviously pretty important when we're talking about political geography. Now, in the simplest sense, boundaries are a human-made invention that separate areas of the Earth. In this flip lecture, we're going to talk about that natural features can be used as natural breaks, but boundaries can come in many shapes and forms. Boundaries in the simplest sense are used to delineate ownership of the earth, and these kind of arbitrary lines could be used at a variety of different scales. So when you think about it, when we look at boundaries, boundaries establish the shapes of countries or states. Boundaries are used to understand where cities and towns and even areas, and even boundaries, think of simple of the fence around your front yard. So as human beings, the way we organize space, we're very comfortable with boundaries, so this kind of lends itself for political. All right, so when you look at a map of the world, the map is likely to be a political map and gives you the details of the boundaries of the different states that we have across the globe. So in this, the start of the flip lecture, I want to go ahead and just basically distinguish two main categories, and I could even argue maybe a third category of the different types of boundaries. The first one on the screen is geometric boundaries. Geometric boundaries are basically, again, we're talking about boundaries that use latitude and longitude features. So the latitude-longitude features, the straight lines, are easy to spot because they're usually the only straight lines on the map. Many of the state boundaries in the western United States, for example, such as Colorado or Wyoming or Utah, are actually geometric boundaries. The second type of boundary would be the physical boundaries. And this is a boundary, again, using physical features, which are pretty easy to determine when one area stops and another begins. So, for example, on one side of the Rio Grande River is the United States, and on the other side of the river is Mexico. So, physical boundaries can include rivers or lakes or mountains. Another example, the Andes Mountains is sometimes called the spine of South America and is used to determine the boundaries between Chile and Argentina, and even Ecuador and Brazil. Another mountain range is we could use the Himalayas. The highest mountains of the world separate India from the rest of the world for centuries, causing India to be the subcontinent. So physical features establish boundaries. Of course, they have some disadvantages. For example, if a river determines the boundary, then the project involving a river, such building a bridge over it, involves two governments working together to actually, plan or try to communicate. So boundaries, again, they cause problems. The third category, not on the screen, that would probably add is we could also have the discussion of ethnographic or cultural boundaries. And this is where we have cultural factors such as language, religion, or even ethnicity determining the boundaries that we see across the map. All right, but specifically, besides the different classifications, we want to talk about the basic types of boundaries that change, which are antecedent boundaries, subsequent boundaries, and superimposed and relic boundaries. First category we classify is antecedent boundaries. And these are boundaries that actually exist even before human beings. So on the screen right now, another example of a physical boundary, we have the map of the United States, and featured right here, we have the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River, of course, is a physical boundary, but it was there before even human beings started to even settle the area. And of course, United States history kind of expanded to Western territory. So as geographers, we classify the first one, of course, the boundaries were there even before humans settled, would be the antecedent category. Second category would be subsequent boundaries, and these develop along with the development of the cultural landscape. So in this case, it's a boundary that's agreed upon. So the image on the screen, of course, would be the U.S. and Canadian border, which is along the 49th parallel, which basically divides, again, people that want to be Canadian would go towards the north of the border. The United States, of course, is south of the border. Another good example of subsequent boundaries is the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. As the cultural landscape developed, the border was drawn to accommodate religious, cultural, and even economic differences. We could throw another example out there would be a subsequent boundary is the boundary between China and Vietnam, even though this boundary is disputed on many occasions. So subsequent boundaries we agreed upon, and usually again we're talking about the cultural landscape kind of defines of how we mark that boundary. The third classification of boundaries are something called relic boundaries. Relic boundary, just as the term implies, is a relic on the landscape. The boundary doesn't really exist any longer, but its impact is still felt and seen on the landscape. So on the screen, one of the most famous examples, let me see, we'll change that right there, can be felt and seen on the landscape. One, of course, the most famous examples you can think that we can still see is the Great Wall of China. It's still there, of course. You can go visit and walk on it someday, but we don't necessarily see it's actually using or serving its purpose as a boundary within China. Another example of this would be going into history, which is looking at the relic known as the Berlin Wall boundary. So an old boundary between East and West Germany is a good example. So going back to your history books, post-World War II, we have the division between Germany as we're rebuilding, where we have the West kind of supporting again with the United States help. And then we have the East, which is supported by Russia and communism. Now, this boundary is going to pretty much divide this country for decades, and the economic development of Western Germany was far greater than we see in Eastern Germany. Upon the reunification, or actually reuniting these two areas that were once one state of Germany in the early 1990s, the difference between the communist East and the capitalist clearly showed on the landscape. So on the screen right now, some maps to kind of give us a sense. So if you're talking about the Berlin Wall, of course, the Berlin Wall doesn't exist, but the effects are still felt for the people of Germany. Look at the top map on the left. This is looking at demographic data, percentage of young people. So you see the darker shading, which indicates higher. We have more young people living on the west side of Germany. So as a geographer asking questions, of course, if we're doing a WOPI, why do we see that happening? We could cross-reference it with the map on the bottom right, which is unemployment rate. So we see that the economy of Western Germany, there's more opportunity there. There's more people that, again, are employed versus East Germany, where we have a higher employment rate. So we can make the correlation, of course, that because there's more economic opportunity, more young people, again, are settling in Western Germany. And, of course, the question is, why do we see that? And that definitely is left over from the relic boundary known as the Berlin Wall. Here's another cool map that I pulled. So this is actually taken from space at night. And this can clearly show, again, the difference between the western and the eastern half of Germany. So you can see on the west, much brighter, more lights. And of course, the inference is, more cities, more technology, more business. So again, just even looking at this image right now, we could just visually get the sense of difference between West and Eastern Germany. All right, and the last boundary I want to introduce is superimpose boundaries. So superimpose, think about putting something on top of something that already exists. It's a boundary that's created, and usually it's enforced by an outside force. So some examples of some superimposed boundaries. I know in class, one of our case studies is going to be focused on the question of whether Palestine should be an independent nation, and Israel was a territory, or I should say a state, that was carved out of the area of Palestine, which is a superimposed boundary, which we're still faced with the geopolitical consequences of that. Also on the map, or the screen I should say, we have the discussion of the Ottoman Empire, how nations were carved out of that, looking at post-World War I. But probably the most famous account in the history book, and also mentioned in the College Board standards, is the discussion of imperialism, and how imperialism also created a series of superimposed boundaries that we can definitely say have left a lasting impact on the landscape. Now, just a quick history or backstory of imperialism. Imperialism, in the simplest sense, we're talking about stronger countries taking over parts of the world and taking over the social, political, and economic aspects of different areas. Now, we saw this occurring roughly in the 1850s all the way up to about 1914. And a little bit different than colonialism, where we see European countries going around and actually settle territory. Imperialism more so is not about bringing settlers over to live. It's more just about claiming the land and sort of using it for its economic advantage. So on the screen right now, we can see colonial rule or imperialism, 1914. You can see all these different European countries that basically took, we say, their slice of the pie, carving up Africa in this case. And in 1884, European countries divided up the continent in a meeting that was known as the Berlin Conference. So France, Great Britain, Portugal, Germany, those were kind of the major participants. But instead of drawing the borders according to the different ethnicities in Africa, they superimposed boundaries that really didn't fit the cultural boundaries. Ethnic groups that had, for example, been in conflict and fighting for centuries were now just supposed to live together under the umbrella of one particular state. So with the result of this conference, this was kind of a mishmash of countries, when you think about it, that was kind of doomed from the beginning. So this is kind of, again, the European map, but over here, you can see, just looking at languages of Africa, see how different in terms of, how the area is marked in this case, where, French West Africa, we can see, has two major language families, not even to mention the different ethnicities and tribes in that particular region. This one isn't about boundaries, but it's just another fun map that I pulled to take a look at. So if we're going back to the history books and basically looking at Africa, for example, in our discussion of imperialism, a lot of geographers and historians would point to the fact we sort of have a modern day imperialism happening. The title reads The 21st Century African Land Rush. So now, of course, most of these African countries or states are independent. We see foreign countries coming in and investing and developing, and similar to what we saw during the time of imperialism, really investing in Africa to enjoy and profit from the natural resources. So, for example, at the top it says worldwide up to 115 million acres of farmland have been leased to foreign investors. And the bulk of that is in Africa. So interesting enough, again, we see similar patterns, so to speak, of the map of Africa. One more example I just want to give us of superimposed boundaries. The boundary between North Korea and South Korea is another good example of superimposed boundaries. The demilitarized zone was placed along the 38th parallel to resolve a conflict between the communists to the north and the United States forces in the south. The irony or the funny part about this is the demilitarized zone is actually one of the most militarized zones of all the world. But this is another example of a superimposed boundary in Korea. And there was one more thing I wanted to mention in the lecture. Not really a boundary necessarily, but in some areas called the global commons, this is another way that we kind of mark the landscape. Global commons, we're talking about countries do not have the right to actually search for natural resources. So in the case of Antarctica, for example, one of the largest global commons on the map, no country can actually exploit Antarctica for natural resources, although several countries have now claimed land on the continent. For example, Australia has claimed the largest percentage of land, followed by countries like Norway and France and Chile and Argentina, even the United Kingdom. However, it's been kind of globally accepted that land in Antarctica will be used solely for scientific research and not really for any military uses or resource exploration. So boundary disputes could possibly, cause some trouble in this particular region known as the global commons. All right, I think we'll go ahead and stop it here. I'll go ahead and pause right here. Stay tuned, so to speak, for another flip lecture looking at boundary disputes and also looking at the states of shapes. but take this time to go through your logbook. Make sure you summarize and annotate your